A quiet woman in seat 12B, just another scarred face silently enduring the stares, the whispers, the cruel jokes echoing from first class. She looks like no one, but when the plane starts falling from the sky, she becomes the only one who can save them. As oxygen masks drop and chaos erupts, the captain's voice cuts through the panic. In that instant, everything changes. But what the passengers don't know is that one of them caused the pain etched on her face, and now she holds all their lives in her hands. Will she save the man who destroyed her world, or let the sky deliver justice? Every time I see your comments, it reminds me how stories connect us all. Let me know where you're watching from, and let's get started. Rachel Montgomery stared out the small oval window of Flight 447, trying to ignore the whispers and sideways glances from her fellow passengers. A young girl across the aisle pointed at her face, only to have her mother quickly pull her hand down and whisper something about being polite. Rachel's fingers instinctively traced the raised line of her scar, feeling its familiar path from temple to jawline. The flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Rachel barely registered the words, her mind drifting back to the classified mission that had left her forever changed. The memories came in flashes, the deafening explosion, the searing heat, the choking dust, and worst of all, the devastating silence that followed. She shifted in seat 12B, her worn sneakers scraping against the carpet. Her civilian clothes felt strange after so many years in uniform, but that had been a deliberate choice. Today, she didn't want to be Lieutenant Colonel Montgomery, the decorated Air Force pilot with over 3,000 flight hours. She just wanted to be Rachel, anonymous in her faded jeans and simple sweater. A baby's cry from somewhere in the back of the plane made her flinch. The sound reminded her too much of that terrible day, of the aftermath when everything had gone so horribly wrong. 3 lives lost, 3 soldiers who had trusted her with their safety, 3 families who would never see their loved ones again. "Would you like something to drink, ma'am?" The flight attendant's gentle voice pulled Rachel from her thoughts. "Just water, please," Rachel replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. 20 years of military training had taught her how to maintain composure, even when her heart felt like it was being torn apart. As she accepted the plastic cup, Rachel caught her reflection in the window. The scar stood out stark against her skin, a permanent reminder of her survival when others hadn't made it. The guilt weighed heavy on her chest, a constant companion since that day. An elderly man in the row ahead turned around, his eyes lingering on her face before quickly looking away. Rachel was used to this dance by now. The curious stares, the hasty averting of eyes, the poorly concealed whispers. She wondered what stories they invented about her scar. A car accident, perhaps? Or maybe something more dramatic? If they only knew the truth. If they knew that the woman in the simple sweater had commanded military operations, had flown combat missions, had made decisions that meant the difference between life and death, but that wasn't something she wanted to share. Not today. Not when the weight of her last command decision sat so heavily on her shoulders. Rachel pulled out her phone, scrolling through old photos without really seeing them. 20 years of service, countless missions, numerous commendations. Had it all been worth it? The sacrifice of a normal life, missing family events, relationships that never had the chance to grow. And now, 3 more names added to the list of those lost under her watch. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing several passengers to gasp. Rachel remained still, her military training kicking in automatically. She assessed the situation, noted the seatbelt sign illuminating, registered the captain's calm voice announcing some upcoming rough air. Even now, she couldn't turn it off. The instinct to remain aware, to stay prepared, to protect. But who was she protecting now? The thought hit her hard, making her throat tight. Her unit had trusted her to protect them, and she had failed. The IED had been carefully hidden, the intelligence incomplete. She had made the call to proceed with the mission, and that decision had cost 3 lives. A young businessman sitting next to her gripped the armrests tightly as the plane shuddered again. Rachel noticed his knuckles turning white, his breathing becoming shallow. Without thinking, she spoke softly. It's just a pressure system interaction, completely normal at this altitude. It'll pass in a few minutes. He looked at her gratefully, his grip loosening slightly. Thanks, he said, managing a small smile. Not a big fan of flying. Rachel nodded, recognizing the fear in his eyes. She had seen that same look countless times, in new recruits, in civilians in conflict zones, in her own reflection after particularly difficult missions. The interaction reminded her of why she had joined the Air Force in the first place. To help people, to make a difference, to serve something greater than herself. But as the plane continued its journey toward Denver, Rachel couldn't shake the question that had been haunting her since the explosion. Had the cost been too high? The scar on her face throbbed, as if attempting to answer the question itself. She closed her eyes, listening to the steady hum of the engines, trying to find peace in the familiar sound. But peace remained elusive, just out of reach, much like the answers she so desperately sought. A burst of loud, mocking laughter cut through the cabin's quiet hum. Rachel tensed as she recognized it coming from the first-class section, where a well-dressed man was making no effort to lower his voice. "I mean, really," he announced to his seatmate, though his volume ensured the entire cabin could hear. "When did air travel become so inclusive? There used to be standards." Rachel kept her gaze fixed on the seat in front of her, years of military discipline holding her spine straight. She could feel curious eyes turning toward her, knowing exactly what, or rather who, had prompted his comments. "Some of us paid good money for a pleasant flight experience," the man continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "Not to be subjected to the sight of damaged goods." A flight attendant approached him quickly. "Sir, could I offer you another drink?" "What I'd like," he replied loudly, "is a return to the days when airlines had proper screening procedures, when they understood the importance of maintaining a certain aesthetic." Rachel's fingers curled into fists in her lap, but her face remained carefully neutral. She'd faced enemy fire, commanded troops through combat zones, and made decisions that carried the weight of lives. She could handle one entitled businessman's cruel words. "Preston Wilson," he announced to someone who must have asked his name. "Yes, that Wilson. Defense contracting, pharmaceuticals, I make things happen." He chuckled. "And right now I'm making it clear that some people should stick to ground transportation." A few passengers let out uncomfortable laughs. Others shifted in their seats, eyes downcast, pretending not to hear. The young businessman next to Rachel cleared his throat awkwardly and buried himself in his laptop. Another flight attendant approached Wilson's seat. "Sir, perhaps I could interest you in our premium wine selection?" "Oh, certainly," Wilson said. "Something to wash away the unsightly view. You know, my company has contracts with several airlines. Maybe I should suggest implementing some appearance guidelines. Can't have our premium customers subjected to..." He gestured vaguely toward Rachel's section. "That sort of thing." Rachel's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. She'd learned long ago that true strength had nothing to do with appearance or status. Her hand unconsciously moved to her scar, remembering the day she'd earned it. The day she'd lost 3 good soldiers. What would Wilson know about sacrifice or service? "It's like bringing a wrecked car to a luxury dealership," Wilson continued, his voice carrying clearly over the engine noise. "Some things just don't belong in certain places." More nervous laughter rippled through the cabin. A mother covered her child's ears, shooting an apologetic glance in Rachel's direction. An elderly woman, 2 rows ahead, turned around to glare at Wilson, but said nothing. "Sir," a third flight attendant tried, "would you be interested in our entertainment options? We have several new release movies available." "Oh, I'm quite entertained," Wilson replied smugly. "Just doing my civic duty, pointing out how standards have slipped. Someone has to maintain some level of decorum." Rachel took a slow, deep breath, channeling the same calm she'd maintained during countless missions. Her commanding officer had once told her that dignity wasn't about responding to every provocation. It was about knowing your own worth regardless of others' opinions. "I mean, look at it." Wilson's voice rose again. "It's like something out of a horror movie. Bad enough in economy, but what if it had tried to sit in first class? I'd have demanded a refund." The flight attendants exchanged helpless looks, their attempts at distraction clearly failing. Rachel noticed one of them reaching for the phone that connected to the cockpit, probably to report the disruption. "Some people just don't understand their place," Wilson continued, swirling his wine glass. "They think they can go anywhere, do anything, regardless of how it affects others. Well, I for one am not afraid to speak up about it." Rachel remained still, her military training allowing her to maintain her composure despite the humiliation burning in her chest. She thought of her unit, of the men and women who had served under her command. They had never cared about her appearance, only her ability to lead, to make the right decisions, to bring them home safely. The irony wasn't lost on her that while Wilson mocked her appearance, he had no idea he was ridiculing a decorated lieutenant colonel, but she didn't need to prove anything to him or anyone else on this flight. Her service spoke for itself, even if the evidence was written across her face in a way that made people like Preston Wilson uncomfortable. The cruel commentary continued from first class, punctuated by the occasional nervous laugh or uncomfortable silence from other passengers. Through it all, Rachel sat straight-backed in seat 12B, her dignity intact, letting the words wash over her like so much empty air. She had survived worse than this. Much worse. The gentle vibration of the aircraft settled into a steady rhythm as Flight 447 reached its cruising altitude. Rachel watched small patches of clouds drift past her window, trying to find solace in their peaceful dance against the blue sky. It reminded her of countless missions flown through similar skies, though under very different circumstances. 20 years of service, thousands of flight hours, hundreds of missions. The numbers ran through her mind as she attempted to focus on anything but Wilson's continuing commentary from first class. Her hand unconsciously traced the scar on her face, remembering the moment 3 weeks ago when everything went wrong. "Captain Rodriguez," she whispered to herself, so quietly no one could hear. "Sergeant Chen, Private First Class Martinez." Their names were etched in her memory, along with their faces, young, determined, trusting. They had looked to her for leadership, for protection. Now they were gone. The plane hit a small pocket of turbulence, causing several passengers to grip their armrests. Rachel barely noticed. She'd flown through worse, much worse. Her mind drifted to a particularly challenging mission over Afghanistan, where she'd guided her aircraft through a sandstorm to deliver critical medical supplies. The memory brought both pride and pain. Pride in the lives saved, pain in knowing she couldn't save everyone. "More wine," Wilson's demanding voice carried from first class. "And make it snappy. Some of us actually paid full price for our tickets." Rachel watched the young flight attendant hurry forward, her face flushed with embarrassment. The girl couldn't have been more than 25, about the same age as Private Martinez had been. "You know," Wilson announced to anyone within earshot, "this is exactly what's wrong with airlines these days. The service has become absolutely pedestrian. In my day, flight attendants knew how to anticipate a premium customer's needs." Rachel closed her eyes, remembering a different kind of service, the kind that meant putting others before yourself, that meant making hard decisions in impossible situations. Her unit had been checking a suspected weapons cache when their intel proved fatally wrong. The explosion had come without warning. She had tried to shield them, but... A baby started crying somewhere in the cabin, drawing Rachel back to the present. She watched as the mother walked the aisle, gently bouncing the infant against her shoulder. The simple act of caring, of protection, made Rachel's throat tight. "Oh, wonderful," Wilson's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Now we have to endure that racket on top of everything else. Between the crying and the unsightly distractions and economy, this flight is becoming absolutely intolerable." The mother's face reddened as she quickened her pace, trying to soothe her child while escaping Wilson's criticism. Rachel felt a familiar surge of protective instinct, the same feeling that had driven her to serve, to lead, to put herself between danger and those who needed protection. She pulled her worn leather wallet from her pocket, opening it to a hidden compartment behind her pilot's license. Inside was a small photo, creased from frequent handling. Her unit, smiling, standing together before their last mission. Rodriguez with his ever-present grin, Chen adjusting her helmet as always, Martinez giving a thumbs up to the camera. "Trust," she whispered to herself, running her finger over their faces. "That's what command meant. Others placing their lives in your hands, trusting you to make the right decisions. Sometimes, despite your best efforts, that trust ended in tragedy." "I said no ice this time," Wilson's voice rose again. "Is it really so difficult to follow simple instructions? I should speak to your supervisor about this abysmal service." The flight attendant apologized profusely, hurrying to correct the mistake. Rachel noticed how the other passengers had grown increasingly tense, some putting on headphones to block out Wilson's constant complaints and cruel comments. A young girl across the aisle caught Rachel's eye, staring at her scar with undisguised curiosity. Instead of looking away, Rachel offered her a gentle smile. The girl smiled back, then turned to whisper something to her mother. The mother glanced over and Rachel saw not pity or disgust in her eyes, but something that looked like respect. It was a reminder of why she'd chosen this life, why she'd accepted the responsibilities and burdens of command. Not for recognition or glory, but because someone needed to stand up, to serve, to protect. The scar on her face was just the visible mark of that choice. There were far deeper scars carried by anyone who had served, anyone who had led others into danger. "I mean, really," Wilson continued his entitled monologue. "First, they let anyone buy a ticket, regardless of appearance, and now they can't even provide decent service to their premium customers. It's a disgrace." Rachel straightened in her seat, her military-bearing automatic after so many years. She had faced far worse than this man's petty cruelty. She had made decisions that meant life or death, had carried the weight of command, had earned every scar, visible and invisible, through service to others. Whatever challenges this flight might bring, she would face them with the same strength and dignity that had carried her through 20 years of service. The steady hum of the engines had lulled several passengers to sleep when it happened. Without warning, the aircraft lurched violently to the left, throwing passengers against their seatbelts. Drinks spilled, luggage shifted in the overhead compartments, and startled cries filled the cabin. Rachel's body tensed instantly, her military instincts snapping to attention. Something was wrong. The pitch of the engines had changed, not just one, but both of them sounding labored and uneven. Her thousands of flight hours told her this was more than simple turbulence. A harsh blaring cut through the cabin, the emergency alarm system. Red warning lights began flashing along the ceiling as the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, tight with controlled tension. "This is your captain speaking. We've experienced engine failure and damage to our hydraulic systems. Please remain calm and follow all crew instructions." The plane pitched forward suddenly, beginning an uncontrolled descent. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, swaying with the aircraft's erratic movement. Rachel grabbed hers immediately, muscle memory from years of training taking over. Around her, passengers fumbled with their masks, some crying, others frozen in shock. "Put your masks on, help children first," Rachel called out, her voice carrying with the authority of command. She noticed the young girl across the aisle struggling with her mask and quickly helped secure it, then assisted the mother. From first class came a sound that made heads turn, a high-pitched scream of terror. Preston Wilson, who minutes ago had been loudly complaining about the vintage of wine being served, was now curled in his seat, mask dangling unused in front of him. "We're going to die," he shrieked, his face pale and sweating. "Someone do something." "You." He pointed at a flight attendant who was trying to help an elderly passenger. "Call the pilot. Tell them to fix this." The flight attendants moved through the cabin as best they could, struggling to maintain order as the plane continued its unstable descent. "Please stay in your seats," they called out, their professional training battling against rising panic. "Keep your masks on and brace positions ready." Rachel's mind raced through emergency protocols, analyzing every shudder of the aircraft, every change in engine sound. The hydraulic system damage meant limited control over the plane's surfaces, flaps, rudders, ailerons. Combined with engine failure, their options were severely limited. Another violent shake rattled the cabin. Overhead bins popped open, sending bags tumbling into the aisles. A chorus of screams erupted as the plane dropped several hundred feet in seconds. The cabin lights flickered, then switched to emergency power. "Help us!" Wilson's voice had risen to hysteria. "Isn't there anyone who knows what to do? I'll pay anything. I'm an important person. I can't die here." Rachel unbuckled her seatbelt, her movements precise and controlled despite the plane's motion. She had faced death before, in combat, in that IED explosion that took her unit. Fear was present, yes, but training and experience kept it contained, channeled into focused action. The lead flight attendant spotted Rachel standing and hurried over. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. It's not safe." "Lieutenant Colonel Rachel Montgomery, United States Air Force," Rachel said quietly, showing her military ID. 20 years of flight experience. Let me help." The flight attendant's eyes widened, darting from the ID to Rachel's face, understanding dawning. Here was someone who knew what to do, someone trained for crisis situations. She nodded quickly and gestured toward the cockpit. As Rachel moved forward, gripping seatbacks for stability, Wilson caught sight of her, his eyes wild with fear, fixed on the scar he had so recently mocked. "You!" he gasped. You're military?" "Yes, sir," Rachel replied calmly, pausing briefly. "The same damaged goods you were concerned about earlier. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to see if I can help prevent this plane from becoming a statistic." The irony wasn't lost on the nearby passengers who had witnessed Wilson's earlier cruelty. Now he sat trembling, all his arrogance stripped away by fear, while the woman he had ridiculed moved purposefully toward the cockpit, somehow steady despite the plane's continued shaking. Rachel reached the cockpit door just as another alarm joined the cacophony of warnings. Through the door, she could hear the pilots' voices, tense with strain as they fought to control the failing aircraft. She knocked firmly, knowing that in moments like these, every second counted and experience, even scarred, mocked, underestimated experience, might mean the difference between life and death. The plane continued its descent, the ground growing visibly closer through the windows. In the cabin behind her, prayers mixed with sobs as passengers faced their mortality. But Rachel's focus had narrowed to the task at hand, her military training transforming fear into determination. Whatever happened next, she would face it as she had faced every other crisis in her career, with courage, skill, and an unwavering commitment to saving lives. The cockpit door opened just as Captain James Morrison's voice crackled urgently through the cabin speakers. "Is Lieutenant Colonel Montgomery aboard this flight? We need you in the cockpit immediately." Rachel straightened, her shoulders squaring as years of military bearing surfaced instantly. The transformation was striking. Gone was the quiet woman trying to blend into the background. In her place stood a combat-tested officer, her presence commanding even in civilian clothes. "Here," she called out clearly, already moving with purpose through the turbulent cabin. The lead flight attendant rushed to unlock the cockpit door, her hands shaking as another violent shudder rocked the plane. As Rachel passed through first class, Preston Wilson's mouth fell open in shock. Just an hour ago, he had loudly proclaimed her damaged goods. Now he stared at her with desperate hope, his earlier cruelty forgotten in the face of survival. Other passengers who had laughed at his jokes or looked away in embarrassment now watched her with a mixture of shame and pleading in their eyes. "Lieutenant Colonel Rachel Montgomery, United States Air Force," she announced clearly as she entered the cockpit, her voice steady despite the chaos. 3,000 plus flight hours, combat experienced. How can I assist? Captain Morrison's relief was visible as he struggled with the controls. "Thank God," he said, sweat beading on his forehead. "We've lost both engines and most of our hydraulics. Experience with emergency landings?" "Multiple, sir, including combat situations with damaged aircraft." Rachel moved to the empty first officer's seat, her eyes already scanning the instrument panel. The first officer had become ill mid-flight and was now in the cabin, leaving Morrison alone to handle the crisis. Word spread quickly through the cabin. Passengers who had witnessed her humiliation earlier now whispered among themselves, sharing what they knew. "She's Air Force, a pilot, decorated officer." The information rippled through the plane, completely shifting the atmosphere. The woman they had dismissed because of her scar was suddenly revealed as their best hope for survival. 20 years of service, someone who had overheard her earlier conversation shared. Combat pilot. Even through the emergency, the irony was inescapable. The very person they had judged as somehow lesser was now the most qualified person aboard to help save their lives. Rachel's military experience, the same career that had given her the scar Wilson had mocked, had prepared her precisely for this kind of crisis. "I heard she flew combat missions," a businessman who had chuckled at Wilson's jokes said quietly. "Special operations." The revelation of Rachel's true identity spread through the cabin like a wave, transforming fear into cautious hope. Passengers who had averted their eyes from her scar now found themselves staring at it with new understanding, not as a flaw but as evidence of her service and sacrifice. In first class, Wilson had fallen silent, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. He kept glancing toward the cockpit, his face ashen. The damaged goods he had ridiculed was now at the controls, working to save everyone aboard, including him. Through the cockpit door, passengers could hear Rachel's calm, professional voice discussing options with Captain Morrison. Her military training was evident in every clear, precise word. This was not a woman defined by her scars but by her capabilities that had been hidden beneath civilian clothes and quiet demeanor until the moment they were desperately needed. "She's done this before," the lead flight attendant told a group of frightened passengers, her own voice steadier now. "Lieutenant Colonel Montgomery has landed damaged aircraft under much worse conditions." The transformation in the cabin's atmosphere was complete. The same passengers who had participated in, or silently witnessed her humiliation, now clung to every word about her experience and qualifications. Her scar, so recently the subject of cruel jokes, had become a symbol of hope, evidence of someone who had faced danger before and survived. Rachel's voice came over the intercom, crisp and professional. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Montgomery. We're working to stabilize the aircraft. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened and continue following all crew instructions." The effect was immediate. Her calm confidence seemed to spread through the cabin, helping to quiet the panic. Passengers who moments ago had been crying or praying now sat straighter, drawing strength from her steady tone. The same voice that had been silent in the face of mockery now carried the weight of authority and experience. Through the windows, the ground was getting closer, but there was a new feeling in the cabin, one of cautious hope. The woman they had underestimated, the one they had allowed to be mocked and marginalized, was now revealed as exactly the person they needed in this crisis. Her true nature, not as a victim of cruel jokes, but as a decorated Air Force pilot with thousands of flight hours and combat experience, had transformed her in their eyes from someone to be pitied into someone to be respected and trusted with their lives. Rachel's trained eyes scanned the cockpit instruments, her heart sinking as she processed the cascade of blinking red warning lights. 20 years of military experience told her this was as bad as it gets. The situation was far worse than she'd initially suspected from the passenger cabin. "Talk to me, Captain. What happened before the failure?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the gravity of what she was seeing. Captain Morrison gripped the controls with white knuckles. "We lost the right engine first, then hydraulics started failing. Never seen anything like it. Complete system failure within minutes." Sweat dripped down his forehead as he fought to keep the aircraft level. Co-pilot Gary, he couldn't handle it. Rachel glanced back at the co-pilot's chair where Gary sat frozen, his face pale and vacant. The man was clearly in shock, trapped in a panic attack that had rendered him useless. She'd seen it before in combat. Sometimes even the best-trained personnel broke under extreme pressure. "When did you last fly emergency procedures in the simulator?" she asked Morrison, already knowing from his expression that it had been too long. 6 months ago, but nothing like this. He swallowed hard. "This is beyond my experience." Rachel nodded, understanding the implicit request in his words. "I'll take primary control. You handle communications with air traffic control." Her voice was calm, but authoritative. This wasn't her first crisis, and her combat experience was kicking in, pushing aside all personal thoughts and emotions. The captain nodded gratefully, relief visible on his face. "Taking your command, Colonel." Rachel's hands moved across the unfamiliar controls, quickly familiarizing herself with the civilian aircraft's layout. It was different from her military aircraft, but the basic principles remained the same. What concerned her most was the rapid deterioration of their systems. "Denver Control, this is Flight 447 declaring an emergency," Morrison spoke into his headset. "We have complete hydraulic failure, severe damage to flight controls, and fuel systems are compromised." Rachel checked the fuel gauges, noting with growing concern how quickly they were losing fuel. "Ask them for the nearest suitable landing site. We don't have time to make it to Denver." The radio crackled with responses as she continued her assessment. The primary flight controls were sluggish, fighting her at every adjustment. The backup systems were failing one by one. They had maybe 15 minutes before total failure, if they were lucky. "Colonel," Morrison said, his voice tight. "Denver Control suggests Frontier Regional Airport. It's 20 minutes away." "We don't have 20 minutes," Rachel replied, her mind already calculating alternatives. "The rate we're losing fuel and hydraulic pressure, we've got 15 minutes tops before we lose all control. What's the closest option? Anything within 10 minutes?" Morrison relayed the question, and Rachel used the moment to test different control responses. Each movement of the yoke revealed new problems. The aircraft shuddered ominously, fighting her attempts to maintain steady flight. "Small County Airport 8 minutes away," Morrison reported back. "Single runway, minimal emergency services." "It'll have to do." Rachel keyed the cabin intercom. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Montgomery. Prepare for emergency landing in 8 minutes. Crew to crash positions." She turned to Morrison. "I need you to focus on engine management. Whatever power we have left, we have to maintain it until final approach." She glanced at Gary, still frozen in his seat. "And get him secured. He's a danger to himself in this state." A flight attendant helped move Gary to the cabin, strapping him into a passenger seat. Rachel didn't have time to worry about him now. Every second was precious, and the situation was deteriorating faster than she'd feared. The aircraft lurched again, and more warning lights flickered on the panel. They were losing systems faster than anticipated. Rachel's mind raced through her combat experience, remembering similar situations where she'd landed damaged aircraft. But this was different. A civilian aircraft, hundreds of lives depending on her, and systems she wasn't intimately familiar with failing by the second. "Denver Control, be advised we are losing systems rapidly," she reported, her voice remaining professional despite the dire situation. "Request emergency services at..." She glanced at Morrison. "Wesley County Airport," he supplied. "At Wesley County Airport," she continued. "Multiple casualties possible. We will attempt an emergency landing with minimal flight controls and failing hydraulics." The response from air traffic control was immediate, but Rachel was already focused on their approach. The aircraft was getting harder to control with each passing minute. She could feel the controls becoming less and less responsive as the hydraulic pressure continued to drop. 5 minutes to Wesley," Morrison announced, his voice shaking slightly. Rachel nodded, her full attention on keeping the aircraft stable. Everything she'd learned in 20 years of military service, every emergency landing she'd ever performed, every combat situation she'd survived, it all came down to these next few minutes. The lives of everyone aboard now rested in her hands, including those who had mocked her just an hour ago. The ground was coming up fast, and their options were running out even faster. Rachel knew they had one chance, just one, to get this right. There would be no go-around, no second attempt. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether anyone walked away from this flight. Rachel's fingers moved across the control panel with practiced precision, her mind racing through emergency protocols. That's when she heard Captain Morrison mention something that made her blood run cold. "Defense contractor just upgraded our hydraulic systems last month," he said, wrestling with the controls. "Wilson Industries, supposed to be top of the line." Rachel's hands froze mid-motion. The name hit her like a physical blow, triggering memories she'd tried so hard to suppress. 3 months ago, in a dusty convoy in Afghanistan, She'd watched helplessly as faulty armor plates, products of Wilson Industries, failed to protect her unit from an IED blast. The same blast that had carved the scar across her face and taken the lives of 3 soldiers under her command. "Did you say Wilson?" Her voice remained steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Yeah, Preston Wilson himself was just bragging about it in first class. Said his company handles military contracts too." Morrison wiped sweat from his brow. "Why?" The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. The arrogant man who'd mocked her appearance, who'd called her damaged goods, was the same person responsible for the deaths of her people. His company's negligence, his cost-cutting measures had turned what should have been survivable hits into fatal wounds. Rachel's jaw clenched as memories flooded back. Staff Sergeant Chen's young daughter would never see her father again. Lieutenant Rodriguez's wife had been 6 months pregnant when she became a widow, and Corporal Thompson, barely 22 years old, had died in Rachel's arms, the faulty armor plates having shattered on impact. She glanced at the fuel gauge, watching the numbers tick down. With their current system's failures, survival would require nothing short of a miracle. All she had to do was make one small mistake, one miscalculation, and Preston Wilson would never hurt anyone again. The thought crept into her mind like a poisonous whisper. But then she remembered the oath she'd taken, the values she'd sworn to uphold. She thought of the other 147 innocent lives on board, mothers, fathers, children, all counting on her to get them home safely. The choice crystallized in her mind with stark clarity. "Captain, I need you to make an announcement," Rachel said, her voice firm with renewed determination. "Tell everyone to prepare for an emergency water landing. We're going to save every soul on this aircraft." She reached for the radio, coordinating with air traffic control while running emergency procedures. Her hands moved with deliberate purpose, each action calculated and precise. The same discipline that had carried her through 20 years of military service now guided her through this crisis. Through the cockpit door, she could hear Wilson's distinctive voice rising above the chaos in the cabin, now trembling with fear instead of mockery. The man who'd showed such cruelty earlier was begging someone to save him. The irony wasn't lost on Rachel, but she pushed the thought aside. Right now, he wasn't Preston Wilson, the man responsible for her trauma. He was just another passenger counting on her to get them home safely. "Air traffic control, this is Flight 447, Rachel spoke into her headset, her voice clear and professional. "We're attempting an emergency landing with complete hydraulic failure, requesting immediate clearance of all airways and emergency response teams on standby." As she worked, Rachel felt an odd sense of peace settle over her. The choice to save everyone, including Wilson, wasn't just about being the bigger person. It was about proving that the values she'd fought for meant something. It was about showing that the uniform she wore, even when she wasn't wearing it, represented something greater than personal vengeance. "Cabin crew, prepare for emergency landing procedures," she commanded through the intercom. Her voice carried the weight of authority, steady and reassuring. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Montgomery speaking. We're experiencing severe technical difficulties, but I want you to know you're in good hands. Every person on this aircraft will have a chance to go home to their families today." She emphasized the word every, knowing that somewhere in first class, Preston Wilson was listening. Let him understand that the woman he'd mocked as damaged was now choosing to save his life. Let him live with that knowledge. Rachel turned her full attention to the critical task ahead. The next 30 minutes would push her skills to their absolute limit, but she was ready. She had already survived worse. The scar on her face was a testament to that. Now it was time to prove that survival wasn't just about living, it was about how you chose to live. Rachel's military training had taught her that survival often depended on turning individuals into a team. As the crippled aircraft shuddered around them, she keyed the intercom with steady hands. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Montgomery. I need everyone's complete attention." Her voice carried the same authority that had commanded troops in combat zones. "We're going to work together to get through this. First, I need all passengers from rows 20 through 30 to move forward to rows 5 through 15. She glanced at the fuel gauges, watching precious minutes tick away. Flight attendants, please assist with this movement. We need to redistribute our weight to compensate for our hydraulic failures. Through the cockpit door, she could hear the shuffle of movement as passengers responded to her commands. The earlier panic began to subside, replaced by purposeful action. Captain Morrison watched in amazement as the cabin noise transformed from chaos to coordinated effort. "That's good," Rachel continued over the intercom. "Now everyone needs to remain in their new seats with safety belts fastened. This is critical for maintaining our stability." She turned to her co-pilot, who had recovered enough to assist. "Contact Denver Approach Control. Tell them we need to reduce our speed to conserve fuel. We'll need a longer approach vector, but it's our best chance." The radio crackled with responses from air traffic control as Rachel implemented her strategy. Years of flying combat missions had taught her that fuel management could mean the difference between life and death. She knew exactly how to squeeze every possible minute from their remaining resources. "Ladies and gentlemen," she addressed the cabin again, "we're going to experience some turbulence as we decrease our speed. This is normal and expected. Focus on helping each other stay calm." Through the cockpit window, Rachel could see the aircraft's nose wavering slightly as they fought against the failing hydraulics. She made minute adjustments, compensating for each shudder and drift. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of thousands of flight hours, adapting military techniques to this civilian aircraft. A flight attendant appeared at the cockpit door. "Colonel, some passengers are getting anxious about the turbulence." Rachel nodded, understanding the importance of managing not just the technical crisis, but the human one as well. She keyed the intercom again. "Everyone, this is Colonel Montgomery. I want you to know that what you're feeling is our aircraft fighting to stay stable. But I've flown through worse conditions than this. In Afghanistan, I once landed a C-130 with half its wing damaged by enemy fire. We're going to get through this together." Her words had an immediate effect. The nervous murmuring in the cabin quieted. She could hear passengers repeating her words to each other, drawing strength from her confidence. "Air traffic control, this is Flight 447, Rachel spoke into her headset. "Request confirmation of emergency response teams at all potential landing sites along our approach vector." As she coordinated with ground control, she continued monitoring the cabin through the flight attendant's reports. The passengers had transformed from a panicked crowd into an organized unit, following instructions precisely. Even Preston Wilson, whose mockery seemed a lifetime ago, sat quietly in his reassigned seat. "Captain," Rachel addressed Morrison, "we need to start dumping fuel. We're still too heavy for an emergency landing with these control issues." She keyed the intercom again. "Everyone, we're about to begin emergency fuel procedures. You'll hear some unusual noises. This is normal and part of our survival strategy." The next 15 minutes were a careful ballet of technical adjustments and human management. Rachel coordinated with ground control while simultaneously monitoring their fuel dump, making constant corrections for their failing hydraulics and keeping the passengers informed and focused. "Flight 447, Denver Approach," the radio crackled. "Emergency teams are in position at all designated points. What is your fuel status?" Rachel checked their gauges. "We're maintaining minimum safe levels for approach and landing attempt. Current position is optimal for our situation." She had transformed the crisis into a series of manageable challenges. The passengers who had been screaming in terror an hour ago were now working together, following instructions, and maintaining the calm needed for survival. Her military experience had taught her that people could achieve incredible things when properly led. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice steady and reassuring, "we're beginning our approach phase. Remember your instructions about weight distribution. Stay in your assigned seats. We've trained for this, we've prepared for this, and we're going to get through this together." The aircraft continued its careful descent, every passenger now part of a coordinated effort to survive. Rachel's leadership had turned a plane full of strangers into a team with a single purpose. As they approached their critical moment, she could feel the difference in the cabin's atmosphere. Fear had been replaced by determination. Panic had given way to purpose. Through it all, Rachel's hands remained steady on the controls, her mind focused on the complex calculations and adjustments needed to keep them airborne. She had transformed chaos into order, terror into teamwork, and in doing so, giving everyone aboard their best chance at survival. Rachel studied the navigation displays while maintaining constant pressure on the controls. The aircraft shuddered beneath her hands, reminding her of the helicopters she'd flown through sandstorms in Afghanistan. But this was different. They had 187 souls depending on her decisions. "Denver approach, this is Flight 447, she spoke into her headset. "Request status on all airports within our fuel range. We need detailed runway conditions and weather reports." The radio crackled with response. "Flight 447, we have 3 potential landing sites. Denver International has 16,000-foot runways but severe crosswinds. Colorado Springs offers 12,000 feet with better weather. Peterson Air Force Base has 10,000 feet and clear conditions." Captain Morrison looked at Rachel. "Denver International seems like the obvious choice. Longest runways, best emergency response." Rachel shook her head, her experience from countless combat landings guiding her thinking. "Those crosswinds would be deadly in our condition. We've lost too much hydraulic control." She studied their fuel gauges. "And we don't have enough fuel to attempt a go-around if we miss our approach." She keyed the cabin intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Colonel Montgomery. I'm evaluating our landing options. I promise to keep you informed of every decision. Right now, we're looking at 3 possible airports, and I'm choosing the one that gives us the best chance of survival." The co-pilot, now fully recovered, pointed to their navigation display. "Colorado Springs would put us right in the middle, good runway length, better weather than Denver." Rachel's mind flashed back to a night landing in Iraq with a damaged aircraft. "No, the terrain around Colorado Springs creates unpredictable wind patterns. In our condition, we need absolute predictability." She turned to both men. "We're going to Peterson Air Force Base." "But it has the shortest runway," Morrison protested. "It also has the most predictable approach path and the clearest weather," Rachel explained. "I've landed damaged aircraft on shorter runways in worse conditions." She keyed her radio. "Denver approach, Flight 447 requests vectors to Peterson Air Force Base." She activated the cabin intercom again. "Everyone, I've made our landing decision. We're diverting to Peterson Air Force Base. I chose this location because it offers us the most stable approach path and weather conditions. The runway is shorter than a typical commercial airport, but I've handled similar situations in combat zones." Rachel could hear the murmurs of concern through the cockpit door. She continued, her voice steady and confident. "I know this might sound frightening, but I want you to understand my thinking. In our current condition, we need perfect visibility and stable winds more than we need runway length. Peterson gives us exactly what we need." The flight attendant appeared at the cockpit door. "Colonel, some passengers are worried about landing at a military base." Rachel nodded understanding. "Tell them this is actually good news. Military bases have the best crash response teams and the most experience with emergency landings. We're going where we'll have the most support if anything goes wrong." Turning back to her instruments, Rachel began planning their approach. She drew from 2 decades of military experience, calculating angles and speeds that would work with their failing systems. "We'll need to come in higher than normal," she explained to Morrison and the co-pilot. "Then we'll perform a tactical descent. It's a technique we use in combat zones. It will give us more control over our final approach." "I've never heard of that approach pattern," Morrison admitted. "It's not in the civilian manual," Rachel confirmed, "but I've used it dozens of times with damaged aircraft. It will let us bleed off speed and altitude more gradually, putting less stress on our failing hydraulics." She radioed their intentions to air traffic control, then addressed the passengers again. "We're starting our approach planning now. This landing will feel different from what you're used to. We'll stay higher longer, then make a steeper descent. This is intentional and part of our survival strategy." The next several minutes were filled with intense coordination. Rachel worked with air traffic control to clear their unusual approach path while simultaneously monitoring their deteriorating systems. Every decision had to balance multiple factors: their declining hydraulic pressure, dwindling fuel reserves, and the need to maintain aircraft stability. "Peterson Tower, this is Flight 447, Rachel called. "Request emergency response teams positioned along the full length of the runway. We'll need immediate foam deployment if our landing gear fails." She had seen too many crash landings to leave anything to chance. Every possible scenario had to be anticipated and planned for. The lives of everyone aboard depended on her ability to apply her combat experience to this civilian crisis. Through it all, Rachel maintained a steady stream of communication with the passengers, explaining each decision and preparation. Her military training had taught her that people handle fear better when they understand what's happening around them. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our initial approach to Peterson Air Force Base," she announced. "I want you to know that every decision I've made is based on years of experience landing damaged aircraft in combat situations. We have the best possible conditions, the best possible support on the ground, and the best possible chance of getting through this together." The aircraft continued its careful path toward Peterson, while Rachel's mind worked through every detail of their upcoming landing attempt. She had transformed her years of combat experience into a survival strategy for these civilian passengers. Now they just had to execute the plan. Rachel's hands gripped the controls as Peterson Air Force Base appeared on the horizon. The familiar sight of military hangars and the long runway brought both comfort and concern. This wasn't a nimble fighter jet she could wrestle into submission. This was a massive passenger aircraft with failing systems and nearly 200 lives at stake. "Tower, Flight 447 on final approach," she announced, her voice steady despite the tension. "Confirm emergency crews in position." "Affirmative. Flight 447. All emergency response teams standing by. Runway is cleared and foamed." Captain Morrison watched as Rachel began implementing techniques he'd never seen before. She adjusted the throttles with microscopic precision, using subtle changes in engine power to control their descent path. Without functioning hydraulics, the normal control surfaces were useless. The entire aircraft had to be guided by thrust alone. "What you're about to see isn't in any civilian flight manual," Rachel explained to Morrison and the co-pilot. "This is a combat landing technique we developed for severely damaged aircraft. Each engine becomes a control surface. Differential thrust replaces our failed hydraulics." She demonstrated as she spoke, easing back the left engine while advancing the right, inducing a controlled banking motion. The massive airliner responded sluggishly, but it responded. "In combat, we sometimes had to land with shot-up control systems. The principles are the same. It's just a much bigger aircraft." Through the cockpit window, Rachel could see emergency vehicles lining the runway, their lights flashing in the late afternoon sun. The sight reminded her of night landings in Baghdad, except those approaches had included the added excitement of potential enemy fire. "Ladies and gentlemen," she spoke into the cabin intercom, "we're beginning our final approach. The landing will feel unusual. There will be more movement than you're used to as I manually control our descent. This is normal and expected. Please remain in your brace positions until we come to a complete stop." Rachel focused intensely on her instruments, knowing that the margin for error was microscopically small. Too steep an approach, and they'd hit too hard. Too shallow, and they'd run out of runway. Every adjustment had to be perfect. 3,000 feet, the co-pilot called out. 12 miles from touchdown." Rachel's mind flashed back to a particularly harrowing landing in Afghanistan, where she'd guided a damaged C-130 onto a short runway surrounded by hostile territory. The lessons learned that night were about to save lives here. 2,000 feet, 8 miles out. She worked the throttles like musical instruments, creating a symphony of controlled motion. The plane wallowed slightly in the turbulent air, but Rachel's adjustments kept them on course. Years of combat flying had taught her to feel the aircraft's movements, to anticipate its reactions before they happened. 1,000 feet, 4 miles to touchdown. The runway threshold grew larger in the windscreen. Rachel could feel sweat beading on her forehead, but her hands remained rock steady on the throttles. This was the moment where all her training, all her combat experience would make the difference between life and death. 500 feet, 2 miles out. Morrison watched in amazement as Rachel conducted the approach without using any of the normal control surfaces. The aircraft danced under her command, responding to the subtle thrust changes she applied. It was like watching someone play chess in 3 dimensions while blindfolded. 300 feet, 1 mile to touchdown. The tension in the cockpit was palpable. Rachel's entire world narrowed to the runway ahead, and the feel of the throttles under her hands. Every small adjustment could mean the difference between a safe landing and disaster. 200 feet, runway threshold approaching. Rachel began her final adjustments, setting up the landing attitude without the benefit of flaps or stabilizers. The technique required perfect timing and absolute precision. One small mistake now would be catastrophic. 100 feet. The ground proximity warnings blared, but Rachel remained focused. She'd heard these same warnings countless times during combat approaches. They were background noise to her now. 50 feet. She began the final flare, adjusting the throttles with surgical precision to bring the nose up slightly. The massive airliner fought her, wanting to continue its descent, but Rachel's expertise prevailed. 30 feet. The runway lights streaked beneath them as Rachel made her final corrections. Every muscle in her body was tensed, ready to react to the slightest deviation. 20 feet. She could hear the passengers holding their collective breath. The entire aircraft seemed to pause in midair, hanging on her next move. 10 feet. With movements honed by years of combat landings, Rachel began her final power reduction. Without hydraulics, this was the most critical moment. Too much power would send them back into the air. Too little would drop them onto the runway. The entire aircraft trembled as Rachel guided it through those final feet, using nothing but engine thrust to control their descent. Every lesson learned in combat, every emergency landing she'd ever performed, had prepared her for this moment. The wheels screamed against the runway as the massive aircraft touched down hard. Metal groaned and passengers cried out as the landing gear absorbed the brutal impact. Rachel's hands danced across the throttles, fighting to keep the plane level without any hydraulic assistance. The aircraft shuddered violently, threatening to veer off the foam-covered runway. "Stay with me," Rachel muttered through gritted teeth, working the engines in perfect opposition to maintain their course. The screech of rubber against concrete filled the cabin as she began the most dangerous part of the landing, bleeding off their speed without conventional brakes. The plane bounced once, twice, then settled onto the runway with a bone-jarring thud. Rachel used careful application of reverse thrust to slow their momentum, knowing they had only one chance to get this right. Too much power would spin them out of control. Too little would send them careening off the runway's end. Emergency vehicles raced alongside them, keeping pace as Rachel fought to bring the aircraft to a stop. The cabin filled with the acrid smell of burning rubber and stressed metal. Warning alarms blared throughout the cockpit, but Rachel remained focused, her combat experience helping her filter out the distractions. Come on," Captain Morrison whispered beside her, watching as the end of the runway grew closer. With a final shudder, the aircraft slowed to a crawl and then stopped, barely 200 feet from the runway's end. For a moment, complete silence filled the cabin. Then, as realization dawned, cheers and sobs of relief erupted from the passengers. Rachel's hands trembled as she finally released the throttles. She'd done it. Against impossible odds, she'd landed a crippled airliner using nothing but engine power. Captain Morrison reached over and squeezed her shoulder, tears in his eyes. "I've been flying for 25 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and I've never seen anything like that. You just saved 200 lives. Emergency response teams were already surrounding the aircraft. Through the cockpit window, Rachel could see firefighters deploying their equipment while medical teams prepared to board. The gravity of what she'd just accomplished began to sink in. The cabin door opened and emergency personnel flooded in. Passengers were crying, hugging each other, and some were praying. Flight attendants helped guide people toward the exits, where emergency slides had been deployed as a precaution. Rachel stepped out of the cockpit to check on the passengers. As she moved through the cabin, people reached out to touch her, to thank her, their faces streaked with tears of relief and gratitude. The same passengers who had earlier avoided eye contact or joined in Wilson's mockery now looked at her with awe and respect. Preston Wilson sat in his first-class seat, his expensive suit soaked with sweat, his earlier arrogance replaced by shell-shocked humility. As Rachel passed him, their eyes met. The recognition in his face showed he now understood exactly who she was, not just the scarred woman he'd mocked, but the decorated officer whose unit had suffered because of his cost-cutting decisions. "You," he started, his voice trembling. You saved my life. After what I did. After what I said. Rachel stood straight, her military bearing evident in every movement. That's what we do, Mr. Wilson. We serve and protect, even those who don't deserve it. Even those who profit from cutting corners with soldiers' lives. Wilson slumped in his seat, the weight of his actions finally hitting home. Around them, passengers were still being evacuated as emergency medical teams checked for injuries. The sound of sirens and emergency vehicles filled the air outside. A young flight attendant approached Rachel, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, pulling Rachel into a tight hug. "We thought we were going to die. You saved us all." More passengers gathered around, each wanting to express their gratitude. An elderly woman kissed Rachel's cheek. A businessman shook her hand vigorously. A mother held up her small child, who wrapped his arms around Rachel's neck in a tight embrace. Through the windows, camera flashes began popping as news crews arrived at the scene. Emergency vehicles continued to surround the aircraft, their lights painting the evening sky in rotating patterns of red and blue. The full scale of the emergency response became visible. Dozens of vehicles, hundreds of personnel, all mobilized to help with what should have been a catastrophic crash. Rachel stood in the center of it all, her military training helping her maintain composure despite the emotional outpouring around her. She'd done more than just land a plane. She'd proven that true heroism comes not from seeking revenge or holding grudges, but from rising above personal pain to serve others. As medical teams began leading passengers down the emergency slides, Rachel remained in the cabin, helping ensure everyone made it out safely. Her jagged scar, which had earlier drawn such cruel attention, now seemed to glow with a different kind of significance. A mark of survival, of resilience, of unwavering dedication to duty. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the cabin windows, illuminating the scene of miracle and survival. What had started as a routine flight had transformed into a testament to human courage and skill, with a wounded warrior proving that true strength lies not in appearance or status, but in character and service to others. The emergency responders finished evacuating the last passengers from Flight 447. Rachel Montgomery stood quietly near the wing, watching as shock blankets were distributed and medical checks performed. Her military bearing remained intact, though exhaustion tugged at her edges. "Lieutenant Colonel Montgomery?" She turned to find Preston Wilson approaching hesitantly, his first-class suit wrinkled and stained with spilled coffee. Gone was the arrogant swagger that had dominated the first part of their flight. His shoulders slumped and his eyes couldn't quite meet hers. "I need to speak with you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Privately, if possible." Rachel nodded and followed him to a quiet corner of the tarmac, away from the bustling emergency vehicles and relieved passengers. The setting sun cast long shadows across the regional airport's concrete. "I recognized your name when the captain called for you," Wilson began, running a trembling hand through his disheveled hair. "Montgomery, you were the commander of Unit 317 in Afghanistan last year." Rachel's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. "My company," his voice cracked. "We supplied the armor for your unit, the maintenance contracts." He swallowed hard. "We cut corners, rushed inspections, falsified reports to meet deadlines." The admission hung heavy in the air between them. Rachel's scar seemed to burn with the memory of that terrible day, of the soldiers she'd lost. "I've spent months hiding from the truth," Wilson continued, "pretending it wasn't my responsibility. But today," he gestured toward the aircraft, "you saved my life. You saved all of us. Even after what I said to you on the plane, even knowing who I was and what my company did." Tears welled in his eyes. "I'm going to testify. Congressional hearings, internal investigations, whatever it takes. Other units are still using our equipment. This has to stop." Rachel studied him for a long moment. The man before her bore little resemblance to the cruel passenger who had mocked her scarred face hours earlier. "It won't bring them back," she said quietly. "No," Wilson agreed. "But maybe it will save others." Around them, passengers who had earlier laughed at Wilson's cruel jokes now approached Rachel one by one. A businessman in seat 14A pressed his card into her hand, promising pro bono legal services. A mother hugged her fiercely, whispering tearful thanks. The flight attendant, who had tried to quiet Wilson's mockery, now stood tall and proud, saluting Rachel with perfect form. "I was wrong about everything," Wilson said. "About you. About what strength looks like. About what really matters." Rachel felt something shift inside her, a weight she'd carried since the explosion, perhaps even before. The faces of her lost soldiers would always be with her, but now their memory drove her forward instead of holding her back. 2 weeks later, Rachel sat behind her desk at the Air Force Academy, reviewing flight plans for the next day's training session. After the emergency landing made national news, she'd received numerous offers and requests. The one that felt right was here, training the next generation of military pilots. The morning sun streamed through her office window, highlighting the fresh paint on the walls. Where most instructors hung technical diagrams and regulations, Rachel had chosen something different. A simple framed photo of Flight 447's passengers, taken just after the emergency landing. It served as a reminder that service came in many forms, and that sometimes the deepest wounds led to the most important healing. She gathered her materials and headed to the hangar where her students waited. They snapped to attention as she entered, their young faces eager and nervous. Rachel smiled, touching the scar on her face without self-consciousness. "At ease," she said, leading them toward the training aircraft. "Today's lesson isn't just about flying, it's about why we serve and what that service really means." The students followed her out onto the tarmac, where a gleaming T-6 trainer waited. Rachel ran her hand along the aircraft's smooth surface, feeling truly at peace for the first time since the explosion. She had found her new mission, not just teaching these young aviators how to fly, but showing them that true strength came from serving others, especially in the darkest moments. As she climbed into the cockpit with her first student of the day, Rachel felt whole. The scar on her face was no longer a mark of trauma, but a badge of survival. A reminder that every wound could become a source of wisdom, every tragedy an opportunity to serve. She had transformed from a wounded warrior into something more, a leader who could guide others through their own battles, whatever form they might take. "Ready for takeoff?" she asked her student, who nodded eagerly. Rachel smiled, feeling the familiar surge of confidence as she prepared to share her hard-won knowledge. The sky stretched endlessly above them, full of possibilities and purpose. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.